So good morning. It is exciting to begin a new Masechet, a new Seder. We're going to be beginning Seder Nashim this morning. And the first question that one might ask with respect to, one is why is Seder Nashim after Seder Moed? I think that I think the real, there are a number of different potential answers. At the end of Masechah Shabbos, there was a reference to a pasuk that that hinted to each of the Siddharim, and in that pasuk, after Moed, after the word Itim came, the word that represented for Masechas Nashim, or for Seder Nashim, excuse me. But from my perspective, just interesting to think about, how we're sort of like dealing with, at least with Moed and Nashim, we're dealing with the core elements of how we relate to our families and the like. And so there is at least to my mind a lot of sense to having Nashim and Moed adjacent to one another. In terms of why Maseches Yevamos, which deals with Yibum, which is the obligation of a brother to marry the widow of his brother when that brother dies without any children. So it's an odd place to begin Seder Nashim. After all, why not start with the laws of marriage before turning to death and remarriage? So and indeed there are a number of commentaries who ask this question, and also we try to, as the Tosfos Yeshanim actually notes, we usually try to avoid starting a Maseches with sad topics, and sort of the death of a husband without children is pretty sad. So why do we do that? So a couple of reasons that have been given in the commentary. So first is that we saw in a Tosfos in Moed Katan that at some point in time, Moed Katan was the final Maseches in Seder Moed, and Moed Katan, of course, ended with the laws of mourning. And so the idea is to connect that sad story, those sad aspects, to the sad aspects of Maseches Yevamot. So that was the answer that we saw in Moed Katan in Tosfos. Another reason is that we're going to begin this Maseches by noting, the various relationships, the various people that you're not allowed to marry. And so as a result, before we tell you how to marry, we need to clarify who to marry. And then a third potential answer is that this is an ancient concept. And so the age of that concept, the fact that when it came to Yehuda and his son, his Bechor first dying without children after marrying Tamar, so then he had his second son marry Tamar as well. So that all highlights, of course, that there were earlier marriages. So it's not a perfect answer, but in any event, that's another answer that's given. The Rambam suggests that Yibum is something that we force people to go through, or the Beit Din gets involved to make sure that something happens. And so maybe, but Beit Din doesn't get involved in a regular marriage. So maybe we want to start with things that involve the Beit Din. And then finally, it could be that Yibum involves two different mitzvot. The idea that you're both fulfilling the obligation to create a name for the brother, and the idea that to procreate, whereas marriage only has one of those things. So those are a couple of the different reasons why people suggest that Yevamos is the beginning of Seder Nashim. Now, before we turn to the actual discussion, let me just mention a number of different rules, because without knowing these rules, it's very difficult to understand our Masechet. So rule number one, a man is not allowed to marry his brother's wife. Okay, well, of course, you can't marry him when the brother is married to her, but in ordinary circumstances, even if the brother gets divorced or dies, if they have children, for example, a man's not allowed to marry the woman that his brother used to be married to. So that is a general prohibition. And Yibum is an exception to that prohibition. And so Yibum, when the brother dies without children, so then there's an obligation for a fraternal brother, meaning a brother from the father, could of course be a brother from the mother as well, but at least the brother from the father, to marry the widow of the brother that dies. And that marriage is called Yibum. And the brother performing that Yibum is called the Yavam. So that's an important piece of background. Second, or point number 3, biblically, this marriage only occurs through marital relations, and that is how the marriage gets effectively consummated, both literally and physically, both religiously and physically. But the rabbis instituted something called ma'amar as a pre-yibum betrothal. So we're not going to see that in our first Mishnah, but it's something to know about. Then the other thing to note is when a woman is subject to yibum, so her husband has died and has not had any children, and the husband has brothers, so she is prohibited to marry anyone else until either she marries a brother or she is released from doing so. Now, the rule number 5 to mention is that the process of release from the obligation to perform yibum is called chalitza. It literally means the removal of the shoe, and so that's or removal of some piece of clothing, but it's referring to the shoe, and so that's part of the process, and so that is the name that we give to the process of choosing not to perform yibum. Okay, after chalitza, meaning once the woman has been freed up to marry anyone, the widow once again is prohibited to marry any of the brothers, and vice versa. The brothers are prohibited to marry the widow because, again, generally a man is not allowed to marry his brother's former wife. It is only in the context of yibum that we allow it. Okay, now we're going to get a little more complicated, and this is particularly important for our first Mishnah. When a widow has co-wives, okay, so now we're imagining Adam. Adam is married both to Eve and to Lilith, and so and now Adam dies without any children, and so now Adam's brother, we'll call him Ben. Ben is supposed to marry one of those women. He does not have the obligation to marry both. I'm not sure he can marry both, and so we'll see that as we go along in Maseches Yevamot. This is my first. Well, I've learned parts of it, but I've never gone through the whole thing. So I'm looking forward to doing that with everybody. So, but the point is that the performance of yibum or chalitza with one of the widows frees the remaining widows. So actually, yeah, that would certainly seem to indicate that that you can't do effectively yibum with both of Adam's wives. So that would be but the point is that all you need is chalitza with one, and then all of them are free. All you need is yibum with one, and the other ones are free to marry. And of course, now they're prohibited to marry the other brothers. Okay. Anybody who is now free to marry anyone is not allowed, because again, only in the context of yibum are you allowed to marry the widow of one's brother. Okay, so now the next rule, rule number 8 of the 9 rules that I'm going to give you before we even get started. So rule number 8 is that although the prohibition against marrying a brother's wife falls away when the mitzvah of yibum applies, other prohibited relationships remain. And if they exist between the widow and the husband's brothers, then there will be no obligation to perform either yibum or chalitza. And so the widow can then marry whomever she wants. So, very simple case. and is indeed relevant because it's the first case that we'll be talking about in our Mishnah. So we have Ruvain and Levi are brothers. Ruvain has a daughter, we'll call her Dinah the daughter. Levi marries his niece Dinah, and Levi marries Rachel as well. So Levi is married to Dinah, Ruvain's daughter, and to Rachel, who has no relationship whatsoever to Ruvain. Okay, so if in fact now Levi were to die without any children, so the mitzvah of Yibum technically would apply, but of course Ruvain cannot marry Dinah because Ruvain is Dinah's dad. So, and you can't marry your daughter. And so as a result, because there is this relationship that prohibits one of the co-wives, all of the co-wives, effectively both Dinah and Rachel, both go free, and there is no obligation to perform Yibum or to perform Chalitza. The only time you ever have an obligation to perform Chalitza is when, or in general, the only time you have an obligation to perform Chalitza is when there's an opportunity to perform Yibum. Okay, so that's rule number 8, meaning that just because another prohibition, just because the prohibition against marrying a brother's wife goes away, other prohibitions remain. And then finally, again, the co-wife situation. So I realize I combined my last two rules in the same rule. So again, rule number 8 is that if Levi marries Ruvain, Levi and Ruvain are siblings, are brothers, are two brothers, and Levi marries Ruvain's daughter Dinah. So now if Levi dies without children, there's no obligation for Ruvain to marry Dinah, because although the prohibition against marrying Dinah based on the fact that she was married to his brother goes away, the prohibition against marrying Dinah because she's his daughter still stays around. And so as a result, there's no obligation to marry Dinah. And then again, the second case, the more complicated case, is now if Levi is married to both Dinah and Rachel, so since Reuven cannot marry Dinah, he's also prohibited to marry Rachel. Okay, so that is all, those are all the important rules that if you know them, now it will become a lot easier to understand our first Mishnah. And so,
question, Rabbi.
See if there are any questions on the.
Yes, I have a question. Please. The question I have is co-wives. Obviously, there was a point in time when co-wives were allowed. But after, I think, the 3rd century or so, that was prohibited. So how do those rules apply after the 3rd century, so to speak?
So or there was a kind of Rabbeinu Gershom, which I think is closer actually to the 13th century, or maybe the 12th century. Right. The 13th
I'm sorry.
And that, first of all, that takana only applied to Ashkenazic communities. So the Sephardic communities still had that. I mean, for the most part, you don't see it in the Sephardic communities any longer, but they still had it technically. And so you're right. Certainly in general, the co-wife situation does not really apply today. Of course, the co-wife, the word for co-wife in the Gemara in general is called tsara, which is on some level a pain. And so, which we can understand why that would be the case. All right, so you're absolutely right that aspect, even though we'll be talking about that aspect, it really doesn't apply today, Bisman Hazeh. So any other questions about that? Hopefully that was the clear, during the course of this, we will need pictures. I think that we are okay without pictures for today. but again, and I know that you're on the phone, so there are no possibilities for pictures today. But hopefully, we'll be able to make it through. Yeah, but the key is were those last two cases. Did those last two cases make sense? Again, where Shimon's daughter marries Shimon's brother, and then Shimon's brother dies without children. Shimon cannot marry his daughter. So even though his daughter is permitted to him essentially because as a former wife of his brother, but she's not permitted to him because she's his daughter. So as a result, that prohibition still remains. And we're going to list 15 such prohibitions in our opening Mishnah. Okay? So I want to make sure that first one is clear, because if that first one is clear, then the rest of them should be okay.
Yes.
All right, awesome. So let's get started. So Chameshes Nashim Potros Tsaros Sehen. So 15 women will exempt their co-wives. Now, of course, before we get to exempting their co-wives, it means that these 15 women, if they are married to your brother, and I shouldn't, and when I say your, I don't mean you, Stan, I'm saying one's brother. I should say, just try and always say one. If any of these 15 women are married to one's brother, and one's brother dies without children, and of course, I really should be saying, God forbid, on all of those, but we're going to be talking about lots of sad situations, and so I'm not going to say it every time, but God forbid that this should happen. We should always be able to survive and have children and the like. So this, but in any event, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about all by the very nature sad situations. So again, if one's brother marries any of these 15 women, so then there is no obligation to perform yibum. But more than that, as I mentioned in the introduction, these also potros tzorosein, they also exempt the co-wives. So again, if one's brother marries any of these 15 women, then all the women that the brother marries are exempt from yibum with respect to this particular brother. So to the person that we're starting with. Now, so if there are only two brothers in our case, everything is very simple, meaning there's no obligation whatsoever to perform yibum, and all the women become free. We'll see that just because one brother has a problem doesn't mean that all the brothers have a problem. And the example of that is the one that we began with. Just again, a simple example of that is that if Reuven and Levi are brothers. So again, Levi marries Reuven's daughter Dinah, and Levi also marries Rachel. So now that Levi dies without children, so although technically there might not be any reason other than the fact that Rachel is a former wife of a brother for Reuven to not marry Rachel, we're not going to allow him to marry Rachel because Rachel was a co-wife with Reuven's daughter Dinah. And so as a result, you can't marry the co-wife of one of the immediate relationships that we're going to talk about. In addition, the next words of the Mishnah are v'tzaros tzarosehen. Not only that, not only are co-wives also included in the prohibition based on a relationship, but even the co-wife of a co-wife. And that doesn't mean and this is sort of like a transitive property. So again, let's go back to our case of Reuven and Levi, and we're going to add Yosef to the mix. So Reuven, Levi, and Yosef are three brothers. Reuven has a daughter, Dinah. Dinah marries Levi, as does Rachel. So Levi is married to Dinah and Rachel. Now, unfortunately, Levi dies. So Dinah and Rachel cannot marry Reuven because Dinah is Reuven's daughter, and Rachel is Dinah's co-wife. But Dinah or Rachel are able to marry Yosef. And so Yosef performs Yibum and does not marry Dinah, Reuben's daughter. Instead, she marries Rachel, the other wife that was with Dinah. And now, not only does Yosef marry Rachel, but he also marries Leah. Okay, so he marries both Rachel and Leah. And now, unfortunately, Yosef dies also without any children. And so now the question is, can Reuven perform Yibum with any of Yosef's wives, with either Rachel or Leah? Now, you might think that of course he can. After all, he has no relationship with either of them, except because Rachel was a co-wife with his daughter. So as a result, as a co-wife with his daughter, Rachel is prohibited to him. In addition, because Rachel was a co-wife of his daughter, and we just said co-wives of co-wives are also prohibited, Reuven can also not marry Leah. So as a result, when Yosef dies without any children, God forbid, so then Reuven cannot perform Yibum at all. And now both Rachel and Leah, because those are the only three brothers, do not need chalitza, and they are free to marry whomever they choose. Okay, and so that is the case of Vitsaros Sehen. Now, as is often the case, the Mishnah is going to tell us the cases that we are just describing at the end. But as is often the case, it helps to understand what you're talking about at the beginning before you get started, because otherwise it's so confusing. So hopefully that was clear. If it's not clear, please say something. Okay. All right. So let's now read the whole sentence over again, because we've parsed the pieces and we can finish the sentence. So nashim potros torosein. There are 15 women relationships. We're going to see that it's 15 relationships that cause a co-wife to not be able to let's finish the sentence. Vitsaros tsarosein, and co-wives of co-wives, min chalitza o min yibum, meaning they exempt all the women from the obligation to do either chalitza or yibum, meaning that they immediately become free to marry whomever they choose. And ad sof ha'olam. Now, this language of ad sof ha'olam, we're going to explain, but what it means is that we just did an example with 3 brothers. But the point, and we said that Reuven cannot marry either Rachel or Leah because Rachel was a co-wife with his daughter Dinah. Well, if now let's say there were 4 brothers, and the 4th brother now marries Leah as part of his Yibum, and he performs Yibum, and now Reuven and so this 4th brother will call him Shimon. Shimon marries Leah, who was a co-wife of Rachel, who was a co-wife of Dinah, and now now Shimon, in addition to marrying Leah, marries Sarah, and now, unfortunately, again, Shimon dies without any children because Sarah is the co-wife of Leah. Leah was the co-wife of Rachel. Rachel was the co-wife of Dinah. Dinah is Reuven's daughter. So as a result of that long process, Reuven is not allowed to even marry Sarah. And so as a result, and that will go on ad infinitum. And so that is the key piece to understand. So now that we've done all that, we've discussed the first of the relationships that we're going to talk about in our Mishnah. The number 1 relationship, the Eluhain, Bito. Number 1 is where it's the person's daughter, where it's the Yevam's daughter. So again, that was obvious, right? Again, Reuven's daughter is Dinah. Dinah marries her uncle, and then everything proceeds from there, and it's all prohibited. but it doesn't make a difference whether it's his daughter or any of the other relationships that we're about to say. So let's go through all the 15 relationships. So relationship number 1 was the daughter. Relationship number 2 is Uvat Bito, his daughter's daughter. All right. Relationship number 3, Uvat Beno, the daughter of his son. Okay. So now we've covered the granddaughter, whether through a daughter or through a son. Relationship number 4, Bat Ishto. One second, Bat Ishto, his wife's daughter. So the question is, how does this relate to his daughter? And so Rashi explains that actually when we said Bito and Bat Bito, it's not only his daughter directly, but his daughter with his wife, but even a daughter that he has outside of wedlock. So that is a key element to it as well. So Bat Ishto, so not only his daughter but his wife's daughter, Uvat Bina, and the daughter of her son. So that means his wife's granddaughter through a son, Uvas Bita, and his wife's granddaughter through a daughter, Chamoso, his mother-in-law, Ve'em Chamoso, his mother-in-law's mother. So Ve'em Chamiv, his father-in-law's mother. So again, could be any of those people who marry a brother and then doesn't have any children. So obviously, in these situations, the mother-in-law marries the brother after having the child with somebody else who then marries the person. So when we talk about the mother-in-law, right? So for example, if let's just choose some new names. So Alice's daughter Devora. So Alice's daughter Devora, Alice was married first to Ben, and Alice and Ben have Devora. Devora marries the Yavam, marries the person who's now the brother, and now the other brother, will call him George. So George and we'll do Sam. Sam marries Devora. George now unfortunately Alice's husband Ben dies, and Alice now marries George. And so now that Alice and George are married, so even though Alice is Sam's mother-in-law, Alice could end up falling to Sam as a potential Yibum candidate if now George and Alice, if George doesn't have any children, and specifically doesn't have any children with Alice. And so if now George dies without children, so now Alice could technically become be required to marry her daughter-in-law, her son-in-law, Sam. But because of this relationship, we say, no, she's not required. Okay, so that's the mother-in-law situation. The Aim Chamaso, and the mother-in-law's mother, the Aim Chamav, and also the father-in-law's mother. So even if it's a grandparent relationship, Achoso Me'imo, the maternal sister. So now you can have, so again, we'll have Sam and George be the siblings. And so Sam is, and George marries now Sam's mother is not George's mother. So Sam and George are only paternal siblings, and Sam's mother, before she married Sam's father, had a daughter with somebody else, and so now George marries that daughter, and if George were to pass away, so now that would result in, without children, that would result in Sam having a Yibum potential relationship with his half sister, with his maternal sister. And so that is also prohibited. And as a result, the co-wives of that maternal sister are also prohibited to Sam. Okay, so that's case number 10. All right. The achot ishto. V'achot imo. Achot imo, the mother's sister. So that's the aunt from, related to the mother. The achot ishto, the wife's sister, his own wife's sister. So, for example, when Rachel and Leah, if Rachel and Leah marry, who are sisters, marry Esav and Yaakov respectively. So, if one of them dies, so then the other one can't marry the sister of his current wife, and similarly cannot marry the co-wives of his wife's sister. The Eishes achiv mimo, and then his maternal brother's wife. So that's that's talking about again a situation where your maternal brother gets married to a woman, and now she passes. Right. So as a result, that relationship remains, and you can no longer marry that person, even if that person were to now marry your half brother from your father. So that maternal brother's wife, your former aunt through marriage, is not allowed to marry. You're not allowed to marry that person, even if she then marries your paternal brother, and your paternal brother passes away without children. So that was number 13. Number 14, the Eishes achiv shelo haya ba'olamo. Okay, so this is a little complicated. So Rashi will help us out. Kagon Ruvain shemes below banim. You have Ruvain dies without children. The nolad lo la'achar misa, and he has a brother born after he dies. So you have so Ruvain is Ushmo Levi. We'll call him Levi. So Levi is born after Ruvain, his brother, has died. Okay, the Amad Shimon, the Yibom Ishto, right? So Ruvain died, and Ruvain was married to his wife. We'll call her Rachel. So Ruvain was married to Rachel. So Ruvain dies while Shimon is already alive, but Levi has not yet been born. So now Shimon marries Rachel, and so the lo isha acheret, and Shimon also has another wife. We'll call her Shoshana. So Shimon is married to both Shoshana and Rachel, and now, unfortunately, Shimon dies without any children. Umeid below banim, and now Shimon has died without any children. The naflu shtehen lifnei Levi, but now Levi is born, and so as a result, technically, you might have thought, well, sure, Levi can marry either Rachel or Shoshana, but we're going to say no. Shteyan Peturos, Lefi She'eshes Ruvain, Shenasa Shimon Asuru Levi, because Ruvain's wife Rachel, who now married Shimon as a result of Yibum, she remains prohibited to Levi. V'anosh karas aleha, and it would be a punishable by karas for him to marry her. And the reason she's prohibited is because she was married to his brother while and his brother passed away before he was born, and so there's no yibum potential relationship. And so as a result, not only can Levi not marry Rachel, but he cannot even marry Shoshana because of his relationship, because of his prohibited relationship with Rachel. So that was a little complicated, making sure you understand it. So again, this is where one of you have three brothers. The third brother wasn't born when the first brother dies. The second brother performs yibum, has two wives. Now the second brother also dies. So the third brother, who is now alive, cannot perform yibum with respect to either of the wives, because one of those wives was the wife of the first brother who died before he was born. Okay, so that is case number 14. Complicated, right? This is our heads are going to hurt after every time. I think, at least I know my head.
Every example.
What?
Every example, your head spins.
Yes, yeah, your head spins after every example. All right, the last one is not anywhere near as complicated, and that is kalato. That is the daughter-in-law. So just as if Reuven has a daughter, Dinah, if he also has a daughter, if instead he had a daughter-in-law, Dinah, and now Dinah's the daughter-in-law husband unfortunately dies or they get divorced, and now Dinah marries Reuven's brother Levi, and now Levi is married to Dinah, the daughter-in-law, and Leah. So as a result, now if Levi dies without any children, not only can Reuven not marry his former daughter-in-law Dinah, but he cannot even marry his former sister-in-law Leah, because Leah was a co-wife with his daughter-in-law Dinah. So Hare Elu Hotros Tsaroseim Vitsaros Tsaroseim Min HaChalitza Umin HaYibum Ad Sof HaOlam. So all 15 of these categories exempt their co-wives and the co-wives of their co-wives, meaning again, you can go in as many, as long as you can trace the co-wife situation back to one of these 15 women, that person is going to be prohibited to do chalitza and yibum for that person forever. And again, the ad sof ha'olam means it goes ad infinitum, as many co-wives as there are brothers. So if there were 100 brothers, each one adding a new co-wife to the one before, that would be a very big tragedy, but it also would result in the very first brother not being able to marry and perform chalitza or yibum on any of those wives because of the first relationship with the that he has with one of the co-wives of one of the brothers. All right, the chulan imesu. So now the question is, what happens if the co-wife who created the problematic relationship died, okay, before the husband died? So let's go through the case. All right, so again, Reuven has a daughter, Dinah. Dinah marries the uncle Levi. Levi marries Leah, so Levi is married to both Leah and Dinah. Before Levi dies without any children, Dinah dies without any children. Okay, so now we're going to finish the sentence, and we'll talk about other cases as well. Does that mean that now Reuven can perform yibum with Leah? Because when Levi died, he only had one wife, and that one wife, although she used to be a co-wife with Reuven's daughter Dinah, at the time that Levi died, she was not a co-wife with his daughter Dinah. So what's the status? So let's take a look. V'chula mesu o me'anu, and we'll just define me'anu in a moment. Onis garshu, or they got divorced. O shenimtzu at islandess, or it turned out that she was an islandess, and we'll explain that one in a moment. So rosei and mutaros, then the co-wife is permitted. So the answer to the question of what happens if Dinah dies and Levi now dies with no children and he's married just to Leah, so then Reuven can perform Yibum or Chalitza, and needs to perform either Yibum or Chalitza with his sister-in-law Leah. Now, obviously, some of these situations can't apply. They can't be an islandess or a meyanu. So what are those things? Let's take a look and we'll understand them. So first, let's define meyanu. So meyanu is a refusal. Now, when does that refusal, what is that refusal talking about? Let's discuss the following situation. First of all, let's remind ourselves that in the Torah, a father is allowed to marry off his daughter before she becomes an adult. Before she becomes an adult, he can marry her off to somebody, and that is a totally valid marriage, and there's nothing she can do about it. If, God forbid, a daughter's father passes away while she's young, he dies while the daughter is a minor, the daughter is now the responsibility of her brothers and her mother. Well, the brothers and mother have the ability rabbinically, it's not mentioned in the Bible, but they have the ability rabbinically to marry off their sister so that she is taken care of. Of course, it's important to remember that we're dealing with in ancient society where every child is viewed on some level as a cost, and particularly for the very poor. And I mean, we see it actually in some poor places even today, where there is this need to marry off because they don't have the financial capability to care for the person, and so that's the only way to enable that care to happen. So in any event, the brothers have the ability, and along with their mother, to marry off this minor orphan, this minor daughter, to somebody else. Now, because the rabbis allowed this, they also gave, and because there is no requirement to, because there is no biblical permission for this marriage, the rabbis allow the daughter, before she reaches the age of 12 and becomes an adult, she has the right to say, I don't want to be with this man. That refusal, that me'ano, is the refusal that we're talking about. So it's effectively like a divorce, but it isn't treated as a divorce because she's still a minor. So it's even more powerful. There's no requirement for, again, it basically makes the marriage a null thing. And so that's what we're talking about with respect to miyun. So miyun is that refusal. So that's what we're talking about. And of course, that refusal cannot be involved when we're talking about a mother-in-law, a mother-in-law's mother, or a father-in-law's mother, because all of those people have to be adults. They can't possibly be minor children. So that's why that can't be. The other category that we mentioned, and I said I was going to explain, is islandess. So what's an islandess? An islandess is an adult woman who never develops the signs of female puberty, and indeed has certain male characteristics such as a deep voice. So an islandess is assumed to be incapable of bearing children. And if somebody marries a person thinking that they are not an islandess, and it turns out that they are an islandess, so then the marriage is effectively terminated. And so that is considered a faulty marriage. And so as a result, that is not going to adversely affect any of the person's any of the islandess co-wives because they're not considered co-wives of that person. So, and of course, that can't happen with a mother-in-law, mother-in-law's mother, or father-in-law's mother, because any situation where the person has children, they are by definition not an islandess. So that's why that they don't apply. Okay. So now that we had all of that, so again, what do we have? We have two basic principles. The first principle is that there are 15 relationships where if the brother is married to somebody who is in one of those 15 relationships with the person who, with the Yavam, well, then that Yavam is not going to be obligated to do either Yibum or Chalitza. And if those are the only two brothers, the woman goes free and can marry whoever she wants. In addition, if the woman who's in that relationship has co-wives, those co-wives are also unable to marry that brother. However, if the person in any of those 15 relationships divorces or in some way nullifies the marriage or dies and thereby is no longer married to the brother, and therefore now the only wives that the brother has are not in the 15 relationships. So as a result, now once again, the Yavam is able to do Yibum for his brother with any of those wives that remain, because those wives are not at the time of the death of the brother a co-wife of somebody in one of the 15 problematic relationships. Okay, so those are the two rules that we have so far. So now we're going to give it a little bit more detail, and we're going to basically have in the text of the Mishnah the specific cases that we're talking about. So, and this should go a little bit more quickly, and we'll finish the Mishnah, and we will be done for today. So, Ketzad Potros Sarasayim. So, what are we talking about when we say that the 15 different relationships exempt the co-wives? Haisa Bito O Achas Mikol Achas Mikol Ha'arayas Ha'elu Nesuas La'achiv. If a man's daughter or any one of the other 14 relationships is now married to the brother, the lo isha acheres, and that brother also has another wife, umes, and now the brother dies without children, keshem shebito petura, kach tzarasa petura. Just as the daughter is exempt from chalitza and yibum, so too all of the daughter's co-wives are exempt from chalitza and yibum. And halacha Saras Bito Venisas La'achiv Hasheni. And now if the daughter's co-wife goes and marries another brother, so a third brother, Velo Isha Acheret, and that third brother also has another wife, Umes, and now the second brother dies, also without children. Kashem Shitsaras Vito Petura, just as this former co-wife of his daughter is exempt, Kach Tsaras Tsarasa Petura, so too is the co-wife exempt from Yibum and Chalitza. Afilu Hein Meya, even if you've got 100 brothers, and that was that Ad Sofa Olam that we had seen before. So Ketzad, Imesud Saraseyam Mutarus, what are we saying that when one of the 15 of these relationships dies, we say that their co-wives are permitted? If a man's daughter or any of the other relationships were married to his brother, below Isha Acharis, and the brother also had another wife, Mesa Bito, now the daughter dies, Onis Garsha, or she was divorced, and now the brother dies, and the brother dies childless. Tsarasa Muteris, the former co-wife, is now permitted. And anybody, so now final rule in our Mishnah, and with this we'll conclude. If a woman is a minor and has been married off by her brothers or mother and not by her father, so she has this technical ability at any time to reject the marriage until she becomes an adult. And now, before she becomes an adult, the husband dies. Well, and of course, again, she is in one of these 15 relationships with the brother who would otherwise potentially perform yibum. Sarasa choletzes v'lo misyabemes. The requirement is you must do chalitza with the other wife. Why? Because this woman who you cannot marry, because let's say she's the person's daughter. So again, Reuven has a daughter, Dinah. Dinah marries the Uncle Levi. Uncle Levi also is married to Leah. So now, but when Uncle, oh no, that doesn't work. I got to change the example. So it's got to be a different case. So let's see. We'll do with one second. Let's just make sure we get one of the good cases. Right. Okay. So Reuven is married to Rachel. Right. Reuven is married to Rachel. Rachel has a sister, Sarah. Rachel has a sister, Sarah, and unfortunately, Rachel and Sarah's father has passed away. Sarah is a minor, and Sarah is married off to Levi. Levi is also married to Leah. So again, we have Levi married to both Sarah, who is Reuven's sister-in-law, and Levi is married to Leah, who has no relationship to Reuven whatsoever. And Sarah was married to Levi when Sarah's father had passed away, and she was married to Levi by her brothers or mother, because she was a minor and they needed her to be taken care of. And so Sarah is still a minor, and Sarah's sister Rachel is married to Reuven. And so now, if Levi dies, because Sarah is still a minor, the marriage between Sarah and Levi is not a biblical marriage. And so biblically, there should be no problem with Reuven marrying his former sister-in-law Leah, because Leah has no children. Levi died without children, and so now Leah is eligible, and in fact would be a mitzvah for Reuven to marry Leah so that he can fulfill the name of his brother Levi. However, because Levi is also married, but it's only a rabbinic marriage, to Sarah, who is Reuven's sister-in-law, because it's his wife's sister, well, he's not allowed to marry Sarah. Well, and therefore, rabbinically, he's also not allowed to marry Leah. And so therefore, because this is only a rabbinic relationship, we have to fulfill the biblical obligation. And the biblical obligation is to do yibum or chalitza. You can't do yibum because he's not allowed to marry her rabbinically. So as a result, sarasa choletzes v'lo misyabemes. The Reuven needs to perform chalitza with Leah, because he cannot take her as a wife, because Leah's co-wife is Sarah, who is Reuven's wife's sister. And so because you're not allowed to marry two sisters, so as a result, Reuven is not able to marry Sarah. And again, once a co-wife is prohibited, the other co-wives also become prohibited. And so because this prohibition is only rabbinic, we cannot we can't just allow Leah to marry anyone. We require chalitza before she does so. So that is the final case of our Mishnah. So that was all really complicated. So welcome to Yevamos. Like you said, our heads are going to sometimes spin, but I think if we do it slowly and carefully, and I will try to speak slowly and carefully, so then I think we will be great. And I think it's very exciting. And tomorrow we're going to begin by questioning the order of the ervas. The word erva is the word that we use for a prohibited relationship. And that is the word that we'll see as we go. And so the question is how did we come up with this particular order of women? Because there seem to be other women, the particular that we start with the daughter. Let's, maybe we should have started with a different kind of relationship. So, any questions before we close for today? This is like I said, it's gonna be hard. I'm gonna try and have pictures on occasion, and I'm looking forward to continuing to learn together.
Yes, I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you as always.
All right. You're going to be back on Friday?
No, I'll be back Thursday night, tomorrow night.
Okay, so terrific. So you'll be back on video on Friday.
Yes, I'll be back. You'll see my face on Friday.
All right. Well, I'll look forward to that. Enjoy the rest of your time in Florida.
Thank you, Rabbi. See you soon.
Bye-bye.